I'll try and use the mic. So I'm going to talk about two things which are close to the heart of California: water and money. And of course, they are completely linked. There's, we have many outstanding hydrologic engineers who invoke things like Darcy's law to show that water follows gradients and flows downhill and so on. The truth of the matter is, of course, that in California we have economic hydrology, which means that water flows uphill, downhill, through hills towards money. That's one of the things that makes this state very interesting and prosperous. Because this is the nature of us. We're a Mediterranean climate, and we essentially reorganized a industrial and now post-industrial economy by putting the economy where we want to live and moving the water there. However, problems arise. And one of the problems is this concept of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which has been described correctly as the hub of California water. So I want to talk about three studies, with one of them still ongoing. And they influence this ongoing problem. How do we get water across, through, or under the delta towards exporters, or do we? At the same time, how do we restore the ecology? And how do we make sure that in doing that, we don't wreak havoc on the economy in the delta? Because the delta is a place with a vibrant economy. So I'm going to talk about three things. One is pricing mechanisms and how we might, some experiments we did, economic experiments we did, on ways in which we might price an alternative conveyance facility. Secondly, I'm going to look at the impact on the delta economy if we build that facility and if we do not repair all of the levees that are inevitably going to collapse sometime in the future, some of them. And thirdly, the third thing I want to talk about briefly is this concept of what would the cost be of habitat, and can we in fact have some forms of habitat, fish habitat, and farming coexist. So three things. Pricing, how do we pay for this canal if we build it? And what's the problem of getting it built if we ask the users to pay? What's the impact on the delta economy? And can we have an interaction and coexistence of habitat provision and farming? So these are some of my co-authors from all of us from the Watershed Science Center in Davis, except for Stephen Kroll and Jonathan, who are from Colorado State and Sac State. And here's some things. There's a lot of discussion about the delta, but fundamentally, the driving factors are basic physics. It's basic physics. Earthquake. Unpredictable part of the California scene. The Hayward Fault runs right underneath the delta. Flooding. That's going to be a function of any changes in climate that might occur, and management as well. Sea level rise, unless you think people are making up those photographs of the Antarctic, I think that's something that's hard. So one of the problems with the delta is we have got unstable and increasingly precarious levees, and we have to have a decision to repair or abandon. Now remember, there's exports of water going out of the delta to some Bay Area water utilities, some Southern California water utilities, and some agricultural water districts. And it runs somewhere around 4 to 5 million acre feet, depending on what number you take per year. There is a 64% probability of a total collapse of this system within the next 50 years if nothing is done. So you've got a major economy and a major input to the economy at significant infrastructure risk if nothing is done. So this is not a question of whether to do something, it's really when. And so we have these have these driving variables, habitat and sea level rise. So physics is working. Physics is working because the sea level is coming up. Physics is working because if we believe the projections of temperature change in the precipitation, and forget about precipitation, we're going to have flashier, more prominent floods. And physics is working in as much that the levees, which were built at the turn of the century, many of them, are getting increasingly unreliable because the soil inside the levees is oxidizing and going down. So the soil inside goes down, the water outside goes up, and you don't have to be a brilliant engineer to know the inevitable outcome. And of course, a number of levees have collapsed, most recently Frank's Tract. The policy questions are, if the levees collapse, should we fix them? And the classic one, of course, is Frank's Tract, where various estimates put in about a $90 million cost of fixing it when it collapsed about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. And the
7 now.
7, thanks, Dan. And the private real estate value is about 14 million. So let me see, we use 90 million of state funds to repair 14 million of private property. No, I don't think that's a great idea to do that for the other 32 islands at risk. So, which ones are on the do not resuscitate list and which are not? And is that acceptable? How do we get water under or through the canal? Do we subsidize new habitat improvements? And if so, where and how? Policy outcomes. What we've got is the delta interests are particularly concerned about salinity, loss of some of their farming land, and the flooding of some of these islands. The economic policy questions are, what are the economic impacts on the delta? Could we get a tunnel built by user contributions as opposed to general obligation funds? And everyone in this room here is well aware of the environment for floating large quantities of general obligation funds. And what was the cost of habitat enhancement? Can we in fact enhance habitat and accommodate water exports with the Endangered Species Act? Well, here's the delta. And those of you in the back of the room will have a hard thing looking at it, but these dots are levees. So there's levees all around these so-called islands. They're euphemistic islands because these islands are islands below sea level in some places. The yellow lines here are the federal levies. The red ones are privately funded levies by local flood protection districts and so on. That's really important because who picks up the tab when they get fragile? Secondly, elevation. Oxidization has done its thing, and these red dots are islands below 15 foot or below sea level. If any of you who've driven through the Delta and had the experience, which is sort of surreal, of driving through farmland and watching a freighter cruising along about 30 foot above you in Sacramento Ship Canal, you suddenly realize, I'm down here, that ship is sailing at sea level. Whoops, there's a difference. And there is, I don't have time to show it to you today, but there's an intriguing engineering simulation which goes under the technical name of the Big Gulp. That's when you have an earthquake and simultaneously 9 of these islands fail. And the water, salt water comes rushing in here, fills this up with salt. The exports to the San Joaquin Valley and Los Angeles are here, and the whole system is shut down for at least 2 years, with billions and billions of dollars in costs. Okay, so elevation has something to do with it. Here's one alternative I put up, because this is of an earlier book we wrote. This is a peripheral canal. The favored one currently is some sort of tunnel which goes underneath for various reasons we can't go into. But what we're talking about is some infrastructure facility that will decouple exports from the delta ecology and the delta water system. Now, one of the reasons for this, of course, is that the fish in the delta are threatened, various species, and I don't have the fish slide here. But running through the financing side, that the main beneficiaries are Metropolitan, East Bay Mars, West Side Irrigation Districts, and some other districts. They have a very different willingness to pay and ability to pay for water. The other interesting characteristic is the ability to divert water into this system is inversely proportional to the amount of water you want to develop. So if you want to take a relatively small amount of water, your probability of getting it goes up. But because the environmental flows in the delta are specified, the number of days in which you can shift water into an export facility goes down as the facility capacity expands. So we have a very interesting economic situation with this facility. The cost per unit capacity falls off, as do all large infrastructure. And so as you build it so it can take more, the cost per unit goes down. But the probability of getting the water also goes down. And so the cost per unit water has to go up. And the question is whether those two lines cross. And this is an exceedance curve. So as the volume goes up, the probability of getting it falls off. And if you go to somebody and you say, I've got a water supply for you, but it's only good 40% of the time, they will look at you in askance and say, well, what use is that to me? Now, actually, it is of some use for replenishing storage facilities, and that's a valid use. But obviously, it's of much less value than the higher reliability water up here. And the take-home thing is that we wanted to know how would revenues look if we priced things by reliability class and asked people to bid on them. So to find out whether this was a silly idea of to build a public infrastructure or publicly proposed infrastructure, first of all, without a fixed size, but have it, you bid and then we'll build it. It's the opposite of if you build it, they will come. It's if you come, we will build it. And we want to look at how people might respond to these signals. So we got a bunch of students at Cal State Sacramento, and being economists, we decided that people respond to money. So we gave them money. And we didn't tell them who they were playing, but they had 4 different players. They had a large urban person, we had a small urban contractor, we had a large agricultural contractor, and a small agricultural contractor. And I calculated what the value functions of water were for those people. We told each player they got a $15 show-up amount, and they could earn up to $90, $100 in an hour and a half if they were good traders, or they could go home with their $15. And of course we got the distribution, because some students are good calculists and others are not. The interesting thing was they behaved pretty logically. Here's the question about whether we're going to get a piece of infrastructure, a fixed size, built. And this is the probability of having it built. And the black ones are when we've priced it on reliability pricing. So the black histograms show that in actual fact we had a probability of 1 being built, and we ran 12 different experiments over different groups, a total of about 240 students. And the probability of getting something built with reliability pricing was much greater. The computer, which was playing the game against them, would tell them whether there was enough money to build the canal or the tunnel. Take-home point here, that if we price things with reliability pricing as opposed to a flat rate pricing, the probability of getting something built by user contributions is significantly higher. Second thing, what about size? Again, the reliability pricing in all cases except one dominated the fixed average cost pricing, and we had a larger unit, ignore the numbers there, a larger capacity unit built. And so the take-home message was that if we can essentially extract those rents from the people who are prepared and able to pay the high rents, and act as what economists would call a discriminating monopolist, that people will voluntarily bid more accurate prices more often if we do this reliability pricing. Now, there's two types of free riding in economics, and free riding is when somebody gets something that they don't pay for. And if you have this reliability free riding, where you rely on the other person paying the share of your reliability, and there's capacity free riding. The total free riding came out this way. These treatments are, this is a bad table, but basically that's fixed size historic allocations, fixed size reliability pricing, changing size historical, and changing size reliability, and just without worrying about standard errors and so on. These in tens of millions are the free riding estimates, and the take-home point is simply this: that the reliability pricing with self-sizing systems has the lowest free rider cost. Interestingly enough, if we stay with fixed size, fixed pricing, historical contracts, but changing size of the third-party free rider cost is still high. So this combination of self-sizing and paying for reliability is the lowest free rider capacity. Okay, so take-home points. Private financing of infrastructure works in experiments and should minimize free rider costs. These large infrastructures are subject to capacity free riding for pure engineering sizing and reliability free riding if we have a uniform price mechanism. But if we combine reliability pricing with self-sizing, then we'll get the least free rider. Okay. Impact on the Delta economy. The green areas are the areas where some of my colleagues in the watershed science have calculated, I helped a little bit, that these islands have insufficient value both in infrastructure terms and in productivity terms to repair the levees if they collapse. And so we've marked these islands as essentially do not restore. Now, one of the questions that came up was, well, come on, you're going to trash the economy, right? We've got all these bait shops and beer places and launching ramps and valuable farms and motels. So we went to Dun & Bradstreet to collect individual tax data from the Department of Commerce. And we found out that Dun & Bradstreet also give you the geolocation. And we said, okay, where are these businesses in the Delta? And each of these little brown dots is a business. This is the back end of Stockton, this is the back end of Crosser and Fairfield, Rio Vista. The really interesting thing, where are the businesses not? The businesses are not in the dangerous areas. There's almost nothing there, guys. And so the point is that the word about where the levee failures are going to happen is already known by all the local people. Here they are. They're voting with their feet. And they're not putting businesses in the areas which are at risk. Second thing is, well, okay, but we've got an agricultural economy here. What about this? And if you take the average over the agricultural economy of the whole Delta, it looks very valuable. But if you zero in, and we can now do this with detailed land use field by field with satellite data and so on, we did a field by field analysis of these islands, and they're predominantly small grains, corn, and pasture, depending on the relative price. And so these crops have two characteristics which are really interesting. One is they are less susceptible to yield loss through salinity. And secondly, they are, of course, much lower value. and commodity crops. They're not the specialty crops of asparagus or pears or wine or all these valuable crops which are grown in the secondary area of the delta, which are not at risk. And so, again, like the dots on the Dun and Bradstreet maps, it's where things are that's really critical for the economic impact. And if we look at this, that most of these subsided islands are expected to flood between now and 2050. And these green islands do not pass the do not repair test. And there's a write-up you can download from the Watershed Science Center, which explains both the engineering and the economics behind that. So what about salt? This study is the first time a hydrodynamic engineering salt model has been run for this system. And these little dots are all the places where the salt was measured. And I took those relationships, and we have agronomic relationships of which this is an example of how much yield is lost in beans in this particular case, but it's different for every crop. And so we put the salt loads against the crops and against the loss of crop value, and then we ran the engineering model for this situation where we diverted water out and put it in a canal or a tunnel and took it south without running it through the delta. We left the delta flows exactly as they should be, as the law specifies, and we looked at the impact. And here was the really surprising thing. The salt hardly changed. And when it did change, it really made almost no difference to the total revenues. They're less than 1%, of that delta economy. And we ran this for sea level rise, dry years, average years. We even ran it for 3-foot sea level rise and a canal. And we still didn't get it going above more than, for average years, more than 0.5%. Take-home message: because of the low salinity impact of this canal, and because of the low salinity sensitivity of the crops and the value of the crops grown in those areas, the overall impact on the economy of salinity due to a canal is really low, and something which I'm sure, given the cost of the canal, adequate compensation would be easily forthcoming. Point is, we can compensate for this. If we look at it on a county basis, we've got 3 things. We've got salinity, habitat diversion, and flooding. And of those, the really big costs are in flooding. Those are the costs, and this is measured in jobs lost. So moving on to the options, we need to have a levy policy. Our funds are limited, and the levy funds are limited. We need to prioritize them, and we need to focus the available funding on those levies. We can't fix everything, on those levies which give us the greatest social return. I'm talking about jobs, houses, and employment, and industry. We should try and encourage growth in recreation, and it may partially, not fully, but partially offset some of the losses from agriculture. And we absolutely have to develop and can afford mitigation strategies for the landowners. And we should not restrict it to the strict legal definition. Even if they're private levies, we should do mitigation. Habitat. We're doing. So these are the areas which used to be, I think they are still, identified by the Bay Delta Conservation Program for habitat. The biggest one is just over here to the west of us, is the Yellow Bypass. And that's this big green thing, and these other ones are various sloughs and so on. What the BDCP wants to do is to put these into fish-friendly habitat. there's a problem. The fish are salmon. The little salmonids come out in the spring, in this particular run, and they want to be hanging out in nice, warm, shallow, nutritious water in floodplains. I'll show you a picture of my fish model in a bit. Problem is that this area, those of you who've driven 80 or 5 recently will note, is an active rice growing and active agricultural area. And the very latest, they finished planting regular rice about 2 weeks ago. So here's the problem. This is the fish model. These are fish on a floodplain. These are fish who are unfortunate enough to be, these are salmon, left in the river. The interesting thing is that the floodplains are extremely nutritious, safe, and efficient areas for fattening fish. It's a complex thing. Here's a rule here if you want to measure how big they are. Fat fish, thin fish. And these guys, the nutritious fish, of course, are better able to survive and battle predators. There are several factors, I'm told, and the experiments are ongoing on this. One is nutrition. The interesting thing is that the fish appear to like rice stubble and rice residue a lot. They grow very well under it, under their first few trials. Secondly, because the rice fields are carefully graded to flow the water onto one side of rice and the off, when the water recedes, it flows off gently and the fish flow off gently into the river with it. There are no hollows or swales for them to get caught up in and have the herons come and eat them. And so it's, ironically, farming turns out to be possibly looking like a relatively efficient way of getting young salmonids from thin to fat. Something that we want to do, because if we can show that we can partially restore the salmon populations, then of course this allows us to manage it for both ecosystems and exports, both of which are valuable to California. How might we do this? So what we looked at is, this is the farming, and these are the crops. This is yellow bypass, so this is Highway 80, those who drive through to Davis or Vacaville or Woodland, we go off here. Next time you drive it, have a look, and you'll see that this is habitat and farming in action as you drive. Don't look too much, but have a glance if you can. And what we did is we took this and we said, how damaging is it to the farmers to plant their crops a bit later than they really would like to? What do they lose? And so we went and how much land would be covered at different flood levels. So we ran an engineering model for the floods, and these are the flood patterns, and these are different flow rates and so on. But you can see that a reasonable sized deliberate flood, and this of course is the emergency floodplain that floods naturally through a thing called the Fremont Weir to save the pressure on the California, on the Sacramento levees. And what we would be doing is we'd be making it flood longer to give more fish habitat. And so we know which fields are going to get flooded. And then we asked the agronomists, well, what would happen to the yields? And this is a crop which I call tomatoes. You call it something else. But it goes into ketchup. And this is the agronomists ran these models, and these are the yield functions. And basically what happens is, that as you shift back into the planting date, and this is running around May, you start to lose this much yield. And you go down here, and if you put a cost and a revenue on that, pretty soon you get to the stage where it becomes more questionable than planting. So we've got a really interesting trade-off. The longer you have it, the fatter the fish get, but the thinner the farmers get. And we've got to have a balance between those two. Can we do it? The answer is, in economic terms, yes. It's too early to tell in fish terms, because the experiments are going on. But what we've done is we've taken these various scenarios, and I would point you towards one which is called Conservation Measure 2, CM2. And this thing can be run at relatively low cost to the YOLO economy. And these are the costs to the YOLO economy. You can download all these reports from the Watershed Science Center. But what we've done here is, and this report is currently out for review, but it's publicly available if you need it. We've bounded the costs between an annual cost of about 9 million to an annual cost of about 1.5 million. That, in water terms, is small change. The costs, frankly, are a lot less than I thought they were going to be. And particularly if we do some clever things like CM2, where you just extend the natural flooding. You don't induce an artificial flood. You extend the natural flooding for a longer period. And that turns out to be much cheaper, and we will find out in a year or so how much more effective it is from the fish biologists. So, again, I hate to be the bearer of good news, but it's true that it's not as expensive, and it doesn't look that it's either or, it's fish or farming. I think we can have both. And the interesting thing is it might be that farming is actually a better way of having salmon habitat and flood protection in the same area. Remember, if you're farming a field, there's no cottonwoods growing. And that means you've got a clear run when the big flood comes. And Sacramento, of course, is very susceptible to floods. So, the habitat thing is that, in fact, agriculture can yield valuable salmon and flood control benefits. We've got what we're looking for in our natural systems is both an economic and an ecosystem benefit. That, of course, latent flooding translates into losses. And if we can go with the CM2 option and not flood during dry years, which is also, of course, expensive use of water, and likely it'll be better. And therefore, what we can do is we can time our flooding, it looks, so that we can get substantial fish benefits without putting the farmers under so much stress that they go out of business. So what are the conclusions? In terms of the islands, we ought to apply triage with compensation. Okay? We ought to know before the islands collapse what the benefit cost of repairing them is, not like Frank's Track when we had to go in there and repair them right away. For a conveyance capacity facility, we think that it's possible to get private user financing, user-based financing, and set up a user-based finance system based on the reliability value as well as the quantity value of water, and it can be phased in. And finally, in habitat, we're looking at the joint production of both agricultural crop production and salmon habitat and flood protection. So it's floodplains in the early part of the winter and salmon habitat in the spring. And during the summer and late spring, farming. So there we have it, guys. There's three of these aspects where we're trying to work in the Watershed Science Center by combining several different disciplines. There's fish biology, engineering, a little bit of economics, and some public policy. Generally speaking, again, I'm surprisingly, for an economist, optimistic about what we can do in the way of trade-offs. Thanks very much. Questions? Come on, can't do that. Tim?
If nobody else will, I'll ask a question. Have you shown some of these financial concepts to the state water contractors and the Yolo County stuff to the decision makers in Yolo County?
Decision maker, I actually did this for the Yolo County decision makers. I presented to the County Board of Supervisors, and when I explained that I really think that farming can coexist with some of these more restricted flooding options, they were pleasantly surprised, I guess. They thought it was an either-or battle. So that report is currently out for public comment at the minute. We've had some comments from not too many comments from the fish people. The financial stuff has not been published. It's still early days, and in fact, we're thinking of running some additional experiments when the students come back in the fall, because one of the things that was a little bit squirrely was that we offered people rebates if they bid too high. And what we found is that the low-value ag producers, when faced with the possibility of being cut out of the reliability altogether, overbid and actually bid more than the revenues would support. And then we rebated them the money. And so the students were able to take their special friend out for dinner and a movie after all. That was too much insurance, I think. And so we want to rerun some experiments without that. But the results, I think, will still be very robust.
One of the takeaway lessons here is if you stick to historic contract-driven financing, you may be putting your project at grave risk. If
you stick to historic financing and contracts and try and do it through the usual channels, it probably won't fly. That we have to, the probability of getting it built goes down substantially, and that's the take-home thing. We have to have a more flexible and realistic. And when you think about it, I don't know whether any of you have it, but on my air conditioning, PG&E gives me 40 cents a month or something like that, but it has a little controller, and it won't let me turn my air conditioning on really hot days before 7 o'clock, or sometimes it pulses it.